Welcome to Payne on Politics, a podcast where host Dr. Gregory Payne of Emerson College sits down with fellow experts to discuss the current state of politics, public opinion, and global affairs. In a world growing increasingly complex, communication and critical thinking is key. This only makes the Emerson motto, expression necessary to evolution, more true.
Hello, this is Gregory Payne, Chair of Communication Studies, and this is Payne on Politics. One of the most exciting aspects of this podcast is talking to students that you've had in the past and seeing where they've gone since they left Emerson, the trajectory towards success. Today, we're going to be talking to one of my favorites, Susan Del Percio. When you think of the Emerson Los Angeles program, many people think that it's always been connected primarily to VMA. But for those in the know, it really began with the Tom Bradley campaign back in 1984. And then in 1988, when we had the Dukakis Bush campaign, we took a group of students out there, and Susan was one of those. So Susan, welcome back to Emerson College.
It's great to be back on campus, Dr. Payne. A lot of good memories.
Well, I think, first of all, before we go back to those particular days at 21 Commonwealth, which we all treasure, why don't you tell us with what you're doing today? Because I turn on TV and there's Susan Del Percio.
Yes, I've been very fortunate to be a NBC political analyst, and for the last almost 10 years, except for when I went to go work in the governor of New York's office. And as a political analyst, I get to talk about the issues of the day on a wide-ranging shows, one being Morning Joe, which is probably most known to your audience. But on every other Saturday, I do Politics Nation with Rev Al Sharpton, which is a whole different experience. And I'm also doing a lot on streaming, which many of your listeners already know is really the next generation of television. And I do shows like Zerlina Maxwell's show. And it's been fantastic to have that experience.
You know, Susan, when you were here, you were someone that was very impressive because you were a moderate Republican. You were, of course, I have pictures with Pete Wilson. I have you with President Reagan and Nancy. Can you give us your idea? Because you're on Morning Joe, you're on some of these MSNBC shows. Many people would say, well, why isn't Susan on Fox News? Or why isn't Susan on maybe One America News? Can you maybe give your insights of where the party has gone and where Susan is at the present time?
Well, One America News, I just discount off the top. So let's put that to the side. But until about 2015, I would make appearances on Fox News, not regularly, but once in a while. When I wasn't, during a short period when I wasn't under contract with MSNBC, NBC News. And they didn't want me after a while. Why? Because I never bought into Trump's nonsense and frankly, divisive ways of handling our country, never mind his governance. So I'm an independent, center conservative Republican that believes in the values and ideals of when the Republican Party was, in fact, a real party, unlike what it's been taken over by now. And, every day people say, how are you a Republican? And you always are trashing Republicans. I said, I'm not trashing Republicans. I'm going after the process because without governance with both parties, we cannot have a successful country. So in some ways, it's a little bit of patriotism as well.
Well, I think back when I was a college student, I was president of the Young Republicans. So I've gone through that same walkway. I'm wondering, what do you think is the pathway ahead for the Republican Party? Because it seems to be, it's sort of two paths.
Sure. I actually think it needs to basically burn to the ground and then rebuild. The timing of that is not as soon as most of us would like. And the reason I'll say it's probably 2028 as a rebuild period is because the one thing Donald Trump and his campaign did very, very well, and it hurts to say they do things well, but they were able to build up state organizations, their state party organizations, even in states like New York and California. Even though they aren't part of the political process in those states so much, they are the ones who put the delegates to the convention, et cetera. So they're very Trumpy. They get behind very Trumpy candidates. And what we're seeing now, and even in 2022, is those extreme candidates, Trump-like candidates, are not doing well in the primaries, which means they're going to lose seats. And while nationally we look at governor seats and U.S. Senate seats and even congressional seats, at the local levels, Republicans are losing their city council, their state assembly, state senate, because they're not viable as extremists in certain blue states and other moderate states. So I think once there's enough losses, the leadership will change, and hence new leadership, back to core values, 2028.
Well, I think that's a good prognosis. I think for many people, I know I myself think it's as long as we could have two healthy parties with distinct philosophical, ideological, and economic views, that would be great. When you were studying political communication, it was what I would say was a golden time. We've now regained that, I think, a bit with the polling program, and we're coming back to that. What do you remember about your time at 21 Commonwealth, your trip out to Los Angeles, and your experiences at Emerson?
Well, I didn't know it at the time, but I was having a unique Emerson experience because I was out in California working. I was doing an internship that I was there 5 days, sometimes 7 days a week. So I had that, and then it balanced with the classes back at 21 Commonwealth Avenue. And I've mentioned this to you personally, so I don't think you'll mind me sharing, that your class on Kent State was probably the biggest influence, even more so than my internships, on my thinking and probably how I evolved into this career path, because it forced us to look at communication, which back then, 30 years ago, we weren't necessarily talking about as a hot button issue as we are today. So it was really special. And it was the golden time because there were Democrats and Republicans, and we didn't argue and kill each other. We had differences of opinions and couldn't realize what was good or what was bad about a political situation, not necessarily just through a political lens. So I think having the internship, Kent State was just a brilliant class. And I know you just went to Kent State recently, which, touched my heart. And being able to have the other core curriculum classes, it really lent itself to a unique experience. And fast forward 30 years, I was telling someone interested in coming to Emerson College, it was great for me because it allowed you to create your own program. And she said, that's why I want to go. I was like, it's great that they still do it.
Well, it's intriguing because a friend who helps with this podcast, Shepard Vargo, is a resident of Ohio. He came back and went to Kent. And of course, this was the anniversary. It was difficult to go back for many reasons. But I think we can see, as you said, the power of communication. If we switch gears a bit, now you're actively engaged with Emerson Polling, with Spencer Kimball. He's invigorated the interest in political communication through Emerson Polling. Could you tell us a bit about what you're doing with Emerson Polling as we see it in media throughout the country?
Sure, but first I have to thank you again, because back in 2019, you asked me to the Washington, D.C. program to speak on a panel. And that was in the first time in almost 30 years, I was fully back engaged with Emerson, which was fantastic. And I started advising a little bit on the communication work with the polling center. Things happened, COVID happened, but I am so thrilled to be back now, today in 2022, with Emerson College polling, because I think we really need to take it to the next level. We are a player in national politics, state and local politics. And as such a well-regarded institution, it's on us to keep providing such valuable research, which is why I am thrilled that thanks to actually a trustee, Robert Miller, we were able to fund Unlocking the Hispanic Vote, where we're looking at 6 states in the span of 6 months, or 5 months, I should say, and really going into certain states and learning about the attitudes and beliefs about voting, about parties, about policy within this community, the Hispanic community, which is often unrecognized, and their voices are not heard. And we want to really amplify those voices.
I think, Susan, as you've said, it was certainly exciting. I had been following your career. And when Spencer and I decided to ask you and Larry Raskey, of course, we miss Larry. He was taken from us because of COVID. But it was great to see you all sort of measure up and connect there with Kathleen Kendall. I think one thing that was very, very dominant within the immersive aspect of when you were here in the 90s and now is you learn in the classroom, but you also learn outside the classroom. What are you seeing the Emerson students in polling and political communication doing that reminds you of when you were here then?
Sure. Well, I was very fortunate to, I think it was last month, to sit in on one of your classes. I also sat on one of Spencer Kimball's classes and Camille Mumford's classes. And what I saw were students learning real practical skills, which frankly I never had during my education. I mean, polling, we recognized it, but it wasn't as thorough a class or anything. So when I was taking questions, I was really impressed by Emerson College students in saying, I'm working on this project where I'm trying to learn what the value is, fill up the blank, or what kind of nonprofit they envision working for and providing research to. So it is like the true culmination of like outside work and classroom work, and it's exploding in the classroom. But I do have to correct myself a little bit. There was one time, and I keep referring to you because you were the leader, Dr. Payne, we had a class where we made ads. And you had back then what we called mass communication, which was TV and radio for the most part, and film, and communication studies, which was any ranging from public relations to political communication. And you put us together, the classes together, and you were like, come out with an ad for the League of Women Voters. So we did get some of that practical stuff in the class, but it's great to see that Emerson has evolved with the times and continues to provide that to its students.
That's great to hear. I think that's always been a piece of the special sauce that Emerson adds. I know that it's exciting for me, having graduated from the Kennedy School, to see that Emerson Polling was invited over. And Isabel was able to provide exactly that, the unique approach that Spencer's doing in terms of surveys, et cetera. When you think about your Emerson career, what do you think, and what would you say to students now studying at Emerson who might be studying? What do you think is that Emerson difference, of course, with the foundation as being the first school of communication in the United States?
Yeah, I think that there's something to be said about Emerson's reputation of when you're going for a job, the difference between an Emerson student and, let's say, a Syracuse student is that the Syracuse student learned in the classroom. The Emerson College student has already done it through an internship. They've already worked. They know what it's like to be in that situation. So that is certainly something that has continued on through the years without question. But I think that, you talk about that special sauce. And the special sauce really is, and I would advise students to take advantage of this, is take a shot in something different or unique. I didn't know I was interested in political communication. I took a basic course in political science and was kind of exposed to it after. But take a class that's different. Mix something up. Take a theater class or take a polling class or do something that's not in your major, because you're going to learn something new and a new perspective. And that expands your thinking. And the more you can expand your thinking, the better you will be at whatever you're doing.
Well, Susan, I'd like to thank you for joining us today in terms of giving us some insights of what makes, as we say, the special sauce at Emerson. When I think back when I was teaching in the 90s, teaching students like you, I remember that Huntley Brinkley was two very important news correspondents. And David Brinkley indicated that his memory of Emerson was that he dated a girl at Emerson, and she taught him how to be better at voice and articulation. I think today when you're on Morning Joe, you're an epitome of what people can be. As you said, you might not know what you're going to be starting out, but you really never know how far an Emerson education will take you. Thank you for continuing to enrich us, and as we prepare a new generation of Susan Del Percios and Emersonians.
Truly a pleasure, Dr. Payne, and thank you for bringing me back into the fold.
Once again, here at Payne on Politics, we're dealing with America's favorite pollster, dear colleague and dear friend Spencer Kimball. Spencer, it's the day after not only the election, but another terrible school shooting in America. And as someone who's studied this issue, when do you think we can finally come to grips that America has a problem, and that regardless if you're Republican, Democrat, whatever flavor, we need to do something about this?
Well, thanks again for having me. And unfortunately, I don't think I have a good answer for you, because we've been studying this issue at Emerson for over 10 years about gun control, background checks. We find 85 to 90% in surveys want some sort of background check. And that's just not our polling. We could go back 4 40, 50 years. And you see the same numbers, and yet there is no action by Congress to change these laws. And so I am not optimistic that we'll see any changes from this unfortunate situation yesterday.
Do you think there's going to be a time when Americans just finally stand out in front of someone's house and say, we've had enough? Or is the NRA, these other lobbyists, are they just too strong and they become secondary issues when people vote?
Well, we certainly haven't seen it yet. And so how many more shootings have to transpire for that to happen? I'm not sure. At this point, though, I would be very reluctant and hesitant to think that we're going to see any change. Even a piece of legislation get passed that, again, would have 85, 90% support just for a universal just to show that we're going in a different direction, and we're not able to do that. And that's going to be a problem. Not really for the people in Congress, because they continue to get reelected. And so that's why you see the inaction.
Well, I think there's one thing about being reelected. There's another thing of being what we like to think is the world's greatest democracy, but people wondering what's wrong with America. But if we can switch gears a bit, and let's take a look at yesterday. It was quite a day in Georgia. I think Georgia on my mind. What did you come away with? It seemed like if you were a Trump pick, you didn't do too well in the Peach State.
Well, you could always argue that Herschel Walker was able to carry Trump over the finish line down there, but certainly in that Secretary of State race and in the governor's race, particularly in the governor's race, is a real, in my opinion, rebuke of Trump by the Republican Party of Georgia. We're not talking about a 15-point race, a 30-point race. We're talking about a 50-point race. That is a major slap in the face to Purdue. And to what he stood for. So I think within the state of Georgia, you see the Trump endorsement not carrying the weight for in that race. Certainly helped out Walker to whatever extent necessary. Didn't hurt him, and it certainly didn't bring Heiss over the finish line. He's not even getting to the runoff. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Herschel Walker being, of course, an icon in the state, Georgia Bulldogs national championships. We can think about that now. Raffensperger, I think when we had talked before, you thought he might have a runoff, but here he was able to also nix that and come out on top. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so when we were polling this race about 2 months ago, we had about 60% of voters undecided. And what we're seeing in this race, and we also saw it in the governor's race, those undecideds broke towards the incumbents. So it also shows the power of incumbency. It's hard to beat an incumbent. With that said, these were kind of number one and number two on the Trump, list of people to knock off, and it was a resounding no from the people in Georgia.
Now, if you were looking ahead, I know that David Perdue said he was going to immediately start campaigning for Kemp because the worst thing would be to have Stacey Abrams as governor. How do you see that race shaping up?
Well, it's interesting because now we get into the divisive primary hypothesis where people believe that because of it's a divisive primary that people are not going to vote for the other side. So if you voted for Perdue and you're a Trump person, you're like, how could I vote for Kemp? And so Perdue is a company, is a party guy, so I'm not surprised to see him trying to bring folks over. But that is going to be a concern for the Republicans, particularly in Georgia, if they're able to mend those fences with the Trump vote. Having seen that it's only about 25-30% of the electorate for the Republican Party, but in a contested governor's race, that could make all the difference. And then, of course, you're going to have Walker in that Senate race against Warnock. So that's a seat that the Republicans are trying to flip. And you might see some coattails there for Kemp.
So Georgia seemed to be not really interested in relitigating the past election. If we sort of stay in SEC country and head over to Alabama, that was an interesting contest over there with regard to the president's pick and then former pick. How did you see that, and what do you anticipate for the future?
Well, Alabama was interesting. First in that governor's race, the question was Kay Ivey. Could she get over the 50% threshold? There was a Trump candidate in Linda Blanchard, and she was able to clear that threshold by 4 or 5 points. So Ivey is in good shape. She's going to get reelected, but she was able to fend off a Trump attack in that governor's race. When we took a look at that primary in the Republican for Senate, we saw Katie Britt up there. We had her up about 37%. She ends up around 45%. And so what we noticed over the last week is that Mo Brooks seems to have a ceiling. So even though he's got 29%, I don't know if he can get much higher than that in the Republican primary, but if we looked at Mike Durant, he kind of faded in that last week. He seems to have lost the 6 points, but that 6 points didn't go to Brooks. It looks like it went to Britt. And so I'm not sure if Brooks is going to be able to really compete in that runoff election in Alabama.
As someone who I think is able to really forecast, and especially given your methodology, what do you think the take-home points are for the Republican Party? Many people saying it's too much under the control of Trump. Others saying this breathes a new life in terms of some alternatives. What's your takeaway after Tuesday in Georgia and the South?
Well, I think that the Republican Party seems to have a lot more energy going into this election cycle than the Democrats. It could be that we have an incumbent Democrat and they traditionally lose seats, and so the other party who's not in power will be more excited. But we're seeing that in these primaries, particularly from the media coverage. And I think that kind of shows that Trump phenomenon, that when Trump gets involved, you get more media coverage, more people are talking about it, and creates more of a spectacle than I think what we've seen in the past. But at the end of the day, it's going to be about if the Republicans can hold that seat in Pennsylvania, or if that flips back to the Democrats, can they flip the seat in Georgia? And, it's about taking control of the House and the Senate for both parties. And we'll have to see after these primaries who these final candidates are and if they're able to do that.
Okay, one last question with regard to Pennsylvania. They still have a few votes out there. Do you see Dr. Oz as maintaining the lead and winning the nomination?
Yeah, I mean, he's at the time of this recording, up about 970 votes. It appears that the absentee portion of the balloting is done. So now it's a recount process. And generally speaking, we don't find those type of errors in a recount. And you got to remember that there's a lot of horses in this race. So it's not just finding 1,000 votes for McCormick to put him over the top. You really got to find like 10,000 votes, because McCormick's only getting 35% of the votes. So out of 10,000, you get 3,500. Let's say Oz is getting 25%, he'd get 20, and that's how you make up the difference. The ability to find 10,000 votes would not be good from a democracy standpoint in a recount process. So I got to think Oz is going to take the nomination. The question is, will he be able to flip that or hold that seat for the Republicans in a year that they're going to, obviously need to win?
Spencer, I know as we close out on this particular program, you're going to have a very busy survey schedule ahead. What's next for Emerson Polling?
Well, we got some exciting polls actually coming out before Memorial Day weekend. We're going into we know New York just got new congressional districts. We've got an interesting matchup in the 12th that we're going to be looking at in the 10th. So in the city, we'll have some polls out this week, and our May national poll will be coming out. And then next week, we'll get back into our primary schedules, looking at Missouri and the upcoming elections in June.
I did want to thank you once again. I've heard some very good feedback about your presentation at APOR. And as we close out tonight, I know that many of us want to wish nothing but the very best to a colleague, Bryce Summery, who experienced a terrible accident in Chicago. Bryce is on his way back and is actually working on a project that's going to be looking at how the Tea Party is influencing this particular campaign. So, Bryce, I know you might be listening. Spencer and I can't wait for you to get back and get on this podcast. All the best from Payne on Politics.